Hello, my name is Miller Rhodes, and I work with Intertech Consulting. And today we're going to be talking about using the OAuthClient object for secure calls to web services. So let's take a look at the disclaimer for a couple of seconds. Now, what are we going to be talking about today? First of all, we'll look at some market trends and how they pertain to PowerBuilder and the use of the OAuthClient object. Appian has gotten us well in front of these market trends, which you'll discover later on. Next, what is OAuth and why do we need it? Then we'll get into an overview of the OAuthClient object and look at some related objects that you will need in order to fully utilize this object within a PowerBuilder application. Then we'll look at a business problem calling for the use of the OAuthClient to set the stage for the rest of the presentation. Then we'll do a review of the code in a recent deployment. I want you to be able to take what you learn here and then go off and be able to generate code and make use of this object within your own applications. Then we'll have a discussion of some issues that we encountered in the solutions. You may run into some of these very same issues, so I want to go ahead and let you know how to solve those up front. So now a little bit about me. Let's look at some recent projects. Now, first of all, the project that helped give me a lot of the material for this presentation is a project that I'm currently working on. And in this project, we created several windows that consume OAuth client-based web services in order to allow external customers to securely view accounting data. And then last year, and I also did a presentation on this, I built a CI/CD pipeline for 3 large PowerBuilder applications using Azure DevOps and OrcaScript. And we also migrated this application from PowerBuilder 2017 to 2019 Release 3. Going a little bit further back in 2020, we migrated a PowerBuilder 3.0 application to PowerBuilder 2019 and retrofitted the PowerBuilder PFC to the project. Now, this customer was running PowerBuilder or running their application in interpretive mode. They hadn't even built an EXE and PBDs. And when they moved the organization to Windows 10, that broke the application, and they gave us a call because they needed to migrate their application. And going back to 2019, did a migration of a 200 plus Windows 3-tier PowerBuilder application from a proprietary C middle tier to C# using Snap Develop. Now, some of my skills down here, I've been working with PowerBuilder for well over 30 years, since version 2.0 beta, all the way up to 2021. I've worked on a couple of Power Server projects, and then I've utilized SQL Server and Oracle for the past, well over 2 decades. I've worked with Azure DevOps and still currently work with Azure DevOps. I built C# web services using Snap Develop. I've worked for about 4 years with Git and Git repositories, and I've also worked with OrcaScript. So let's talk about Internet Consulting Incorporated. Intertech is the oldest and largest consulting firm specializing in PowerBuilder technologies in North America. Intertech was the first company in North America independently certified by Sybase and Appian to sell and support the Appian Power Server product. They've been a Microsoft partner since 1995. They were a PowerSoft partner from 95 to 97, a Sybase partner from 97 to 2013, and an SAP partner from 2012 to the current day, and they're currently an Appian consulting partner. So you can see throughout the whole chain of custody of the PowerBuilder product, Intertech has been locking arms with the people who've been utilizing and bringing PowerBuilder to market. Some other things that Intertech offers, or some other services I should say, are they'll help you out with architecture. We can design the framework for any new system or piece of software that you desire to build. We offer consulting services. We work with you to accomplish a specific goal laid out by your organization. We offer programming. Although Intertech is not a body shop, we can and do roll up our sleeves and sling some code when required. Intertech provides Microsoft-based education and Appian product-based education. And then they offer project management. With years of project management experience, we can keep your project on course, manage scope, and right the ship when a project has gone off course. So let's take a look at these market trends and how they've affected PowerBuilder. So PowerBuilder application deployment is moving away from your heavy client front-end applications. To the uninformed, there's still that complaint that PowerBuilder is great for client server, but how can I leverage it on the web? Many of the applications that we are seeing built have the majority of your business logic either in the database or in a middle tier. Otherwise, applications are evolving in that direction. Appian has given us robust ways to consume APIs and/or deploy straight to the web with the continuing evolution of PowerServer. The next natural question that comes to mind is, okay, how can we make the client's data more secure and also deliver varying levels of access to data in the cloud? So, what is OAuth and why do we need it? OAuth is an open standard authorization protocol or framework that provides applications the ability for secure designated access. For example, you can tell Facebook that it's okay for ESPN.com to access your profile or post updates to your timeline without having to give ESPN your Facebook password. This minimizes risk in a major way. In the event ESPN suffers a breach, your Facebook password remains safe. Now, OAuth doesn't share password data, but instead uses authorization tokens to provide an identity between consumers and service providers. OAuth is an authentication protocol that allows you to approve one application interacting with another on your behalf without giving away your password. So let's dig a little deeper and get into an overview of the OAuthClient object and its related objects. Now, my focus today is going to be to define and highlight the specific objects that I used in a recent project and show you use of those objects in several lines of code in order to give the code more context. I want you to come away from this presentation with the ability to duplicate what I did without much experience with the OAuth client. Now, two objects we'll look at are the token request and token response. These are going to be the objects that are used to request and retrieve your access token from the server, which will then be used to get the protected information. Now, the OAuthClient object provides interfaces for obtaining the access token and protected resources, like I said before. The token request object gets or sets the properties for the access token request, including the address of the authorization server, the OAuth 2.0 authorization process, the scope of the access request, the secure protocol, the timeout value, etc. The token response object gets the information of the access token response returned by the authorization server, including the access token itself, the refresh token, the HTTP response header, etc. Now, digging a little deeper, let's look at the token request object. So you can see some of the syntax on here. That's the first line, and you can see that when using the OAuthClient object, you're going to name what the token request object is. You'll have a variable that you put that into, and then what the token response object is. Those are the parameters. Now, some of the other parameters that you'll have to populate for this object are the client ID, which is an identifier of the registered client issued by the authorization server. It's like a user ID. And then the client secret, which is a password of the registered client issued by the authorization server. And then scope. Now, scope is a way to limit an app's access to a user's data, rather than granting complete access to a user's account. Example, name and not address. And what I mean by that is, let's say that in a database we have my name and my address and some other information about me. Well, what we can do is we can just give an external user access to the names of different people, but not provide any of the other more sensitive information. And then grant type, they're different types: password, client credentials, and placeholder string. Now, what we'll be using today is the client credentials, and the client credentials grant is used when applications request an access token to access their own resources, not on behalf of a user. And then finally, the token location. We'll need a URL for the authorization server in order to get our token from that server. So now let's look at the token response object. Here we have the syntax again, and I've highlighted its place in this particular piece of syntax. And then what I want to highlight is one parameter or one attribute of this object that you'll need to populate or use. And actually, this is a function, get status code. Now, this gets the response status code in order to determine success or failure. And if you've used any web services, these are the return codes that tell you what basically has happened, whether you've been successful, there's been a bad request, or the data wasn't found. So you'll know that if you've been successful with the request. And then get body is a function that gets the response body into a string. In the situation that will be illustrated in this presentation, this retrieves our access token. So we're going to get the actual text of our access token that will be used to get the restricted data. And then finally, the getAccessToken function gets the access token returned by the authorization server. So, the business problem calling for the use of the OAuthClient. This is actually a business problem that one of my customers had that led to the beginning of this project. The customer was at the point where the need arose to investigate accessing cloud data via PowerBuilder. What this meant was that our PowerBuilder team would need to call the Microsoft Auth token endpoint using service principal credentials, which is an enterprise applications client ID, and a secret or certificate. So now let's get into a review of our code using some of the information that we've delved into prior to now. So you can see I've put a number of items into instance variables. And what I've done is I've obfuscated or, put some fake information in here so that, since I can't share my customer's information. But what we're going to be sending as the client ID is that long item there that starts with 45M. And then we're going to store our client secret in an instance variable here. And if you notice the two tildes here, that's going to be important later on because anytime you see a tilde, you're actually going to need two because that's a registered item within PowerBuilder that is reacted to in a particular way. And then we have our token location, which is the URL of the server where we're going to get our token from. Then we have the scope. Now, scope is level of access, and what we're telling it here by default is we're going to give generic permissions. So we're going to give the user access to a limited amount of data, and we're not going to let them read or write. We're just going to go and have read privileges to that information. That's what the default keyword tells us there. And then we're going to send the URL as a parameter here, and I'm going to store that. I'm storing that in an instance variable here, and that's what we'll use further down the line in the rest of our code. So next, what you can see here as we get more into our code and our deployment is we're putting the OAuth client into a local variable of that type. We got a local variable for the token request object, a local variable for the token response object, and then a local variable for the OAuth request and resource response objects, which I will define for you later on. Just wanted to show you this. And then we're going to instantiate the OAuth client object down below in the LOAC_client variable. So now let's define the OAuth request object. Now the OAuth request object can use the access token to obtain each property of the HTTP request of the protected resource, including the server address, the request header, the secure protocol, the timeout value, and so on. Method is the HTTP method for sending authentication requests. Values are get and post. And we're going to be using post most of the time, and you'll see in my code later on that I'm using post for the method. URL specifies the request URL. This is the URL used to extract the data from the API. So this is the URL that we're using to go and get the actual data that we're going to be presenting to the user or customer. And then set access token sets the access token retrieved by the token request object, which prepares it for use. So here's where we're actually going to be using our access token to go out and make the request to get our data. Now let's move on to the resource response object. The resource response object can obtain the response information of the protected resource request, including the HTTP response headers and the protected resource returned from the server. The getBody function gets the response body into a string. This is the data we are pulling from the API, usually in a JSON string. And then getStatusCode gets the response status code, so we can test for failure and success, and then take action based upon that, go further in the code, or give the user a message indicating that something has gone wrong. So 200 is usually success, 400 is a bad request, and 404 it means not found. So as we continue digging into our code, I discovered while doing this coding project that our scope needs to be encoded. And so there's an object in Power Builder called the coder object, which encodes and decodes a blob or a string using popular encoders such as hex, base64, URL, etc. And what we're using here is encoding ANSI. And then what we have to do next is we're building a parameter string which will be passed in so that we can go off to the database and pass that information and then get our information back. So this is just information that's going to be passed as part of the overall call. Now here we're populating some of the attributes, some of the parameters of our LTR request object. Here first of all, we're doing a set header, which is actually a requirement for this to work. And then we're setting the method as post. You saw before you can use get or post. We're going to set it as post. And then we're using some of those instance variables that I showed you earlier to tell it what the token location is. And then the secure protocol is equal to 0. Now, all secure protocols it will detect and use are shown in the following order: TLS 1.2, TLS 1.1, SSL 2.0, 3.0, and TLS 1.0. And what 0 tells it is just to detect what it needs to use, and these are the different choices rather than picking one specifically. And you can see we're populating the client ID, the client secret, the scope, which is now encoded, and we're telling it that the grant type is client credentials, which basically means we're using a token and not specifically a user ID and password. We're actually using the token to gain access to the data. So here, as we continue, the API that we were calling within this project sometimes took a little bit of time to extract the data from the cloud. So there's an attribute here that you can set which is called timeout, so that we know that we may need to wait a little time to get the data back before we determine that there was a problem. And then we use the OAuthClient to get the access the token, or to bring the token back. And you can see we've got the LTR request and LTR response objects in there, like I illustrated before and explained, in order to do the call to go and get our access token. And then we're testing for the status code. We're using getBody to put the token, it's a long string, into the ls token body variable here. And we're making sure that was successful. And then if you notice down below, the method here is going to be get. in order to go and get the token from the server, and we give it the URL, and then we have some parameters that we need to pass in order to get the token. And then we're using the set access token function call in order to actually populate the token into a local variable that's been provided here. Next, we go and we call the request resource. Now we're going to begin the process of going and getting our data. So we go and we make that request, and then we had an interesting problem where the API that was built by some of the programmers on our team is sometimes on the first call had to wake up. So what we're doing is, if there's failure on the first try, we're going to give it one more try by testing for the status code. And then if it doesn't work the second time, then there's most likely a problem. But if it is successful, then we go and we see here that we make sure that it is by making sure the return code is 1 and that the status code is 200. And then we use the get body to actually populate the data into a local variable. It's going to be JSON. And then we just have the code here to give the user a meaningful message if there's a problem. And then what you'll see next is we're going to be handling the JSON code and parsing that out in such a way so they can be presented in a meaningful way to the user. As we get to the end of the code that I want to show here, PowerBuilder has an object called the JSON parser, and you can use that to handle JSON strings and parse them out in such a way that it can then be imported into a data window and present it. So you can see I've got a data window called DWCP movement, and we're importing the JSON that has been brought back from the API and is stored in ls body, and we're importing it into the data window and then presenting it to the user. And then you can see that we're then sorting that data, and you can basically take most of this code and it'll get you 90% of the way there. I found this code, or a portion of this code, in some other places and pulled it together to present to you today. So now let's discuss a couple of issues that I encountered while doing this project. So Appian has something called Appian Community, where you can post programming problems that you have, and other people within the community that work with Appian products can weigh in and help you solve that problem. And if you go to the Appian website and go to Appian Community and look under my name, you'll actually be able to see these cases or problems that have been presented here. Now, what I have here is a snippet of one problem that I had, where I said problem retrieving an OAuth token from the server. And if you go and look at this on the website, I also have a snippet of code that you can go look at for yourself. Now, in here I say the code below is what I decided to go with after reading all of the cases in here and the help. So there were some other people having problems, and I tried to leverage the feedback that they had been given in order to help me with my problem. And I said, I'm trying to get my token using a client ID and secret and then use it to access the data. On the method, when I try get, then I get a 200 code, but nothing comes back in the body. If I use a post, and see, I figured out I needed to use a post and not a get, which was some of the problem, then I get a 401 error. Basically, my LTR response get access token call just returns an empty string. A developer on our project helped me set up Postman, which is a tool that you can use to test out your API before going and trying to call it from PowerBuilder. And the API works in Postman, but I have no idea what information I can use from there in order to get this to work. So now let's go and look at the solution, which I actually figured out on my own. But, it really wasn't on my own. I looked at feedback that was given on this case from other people and used all of that information in order to piece together what became the actual solution. So I say here I actually figured this out myself. So first of all, I saw that I was passing in the scope But what I realized is that the scope actually needed to be encoded. And then number two, I had a tilde in my client secret, and that's an escape character in PowerBuilder. So it was getting removed, basically making my password incorrect, and when I put it into a string variable. So I had to change it to a double tilde in order to get the tilde to remain within the string, and that was a large part of my problem. And then I needed to add a population of the request header, so using the set header function and using that particular information as part of the set header call that was in there. So this, hopefully, if you've ever had this problem or you run into this problem, this gets you a little bit further up the road. Okay, so now let's look at a second problem I had. So one of the customers that I work with, they use Citrix to deploy their PowerBuilder application. So when I was running the PowerBuilder application off the network, all of this was working just perfectly. But when we would deploy the application to Citrix, we started to have some problems. And I thought that, well, maybe it's a Citrix problem. Didn't know whether it was a PowerBuilder problem, so I posted the problem here. And I said, currently, we're using the OAuthClient object to request a token and then use that token to get the data using the request resource function. Thanks to a lot of the posts I've seen here, I was able to put this together and it works quite well until it gets into Citrix. In the code below, this line works fine. LReturn equals OAuthClient access token, but this line returns a -1. LReturn equals OAuthClient request resource, and then it's got the request and the response objects in there as parameters. So let's see what we did to solve this. So here's what we had to do to resolve the problem. In our current deployment of Citrix, we cannot upgrade because the organization is on a path to an alternative. Within this deployment, we are limited to TLS 1.2 based on Citrix being an older server and an upgrade being out of the question. So a lot of applications have gone on to TLS 1.3 now and beyond. Now the API being called was being deployed through Kubernetes, which is using TLS 1.3. This was no problem for PowerBuilder 2019 Release 3 deployed via the network. However, this was a problem for Citrix. In order to solve this, we had to settle for an on-prem deployment of the API, which wasn't leading edge or the latest and greatest, but it was TLS 1.2 compliant, and that fixed the problem. So, hopefully, if any of you ever deploy this code through Citrix, this will prevent you from having that particular headache. So, it's Q&A time. I want to thank you for viewing my presentation today. And I'll be here after my presentation during the Appian conference to answer any questions that you have. And now I'll show you some of the Appian information because it's all about Appian. And thanks to Appian for everything that they do for the PowerBuilder community. So I'll leave this up for a while because a lot of customers and probably even some of my customers come to this conference and get a lot of good information and connect with PowerBuilder pros and Appian pros like yourselves. And thank you for viewing my presentation today. Have a nice day.